The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "Be sure of this, if the master of the house had known the hour when the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be prepared. For at an hour you do not expect, the Son of Man will come." Then Peter said, "Lord, is this parable meant for us or for everyone?" And the Lord replied, "Who then is the faithful and prudent steward whom the master will put in charge of his servants to distribute the food allowance at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master on arrival finds doing so. Truly I say to you, he will put him in charge of all his property. But if that servant says to himself, 'My master is delayed in coming,' and begins to beat the men servants and the maid servants to eat and drink and get drunk, then that servant's master will come on an unexpected day and at an unknown hour, and will punish the servant severely and assign him a place with the unfaithful. That servant who knew his master's will but did not make preparations nor act in accord with his will shall be beaten severely. And the servant who is ignorant of his master's will but acted in a way deserving of a severe beating shall be beaten only lightly. Much will be required of the person entrusted with much, and still more will be demanded of the person entrusted with more." The Gospel of the Lord. Today is the feast day of some of the greatest Jesuits, right, who ever came to our continent. It's very sad that in many schools today, when we learn about the history of our nation, we learn all about the oppression of the Europeans, right, against the native peoples. And we don't hear about the great, beautiful people of that time, right? In a particular way, right, perhaps more than any other group of people, our nation and our land owes so many of its blessings to the Christian missionaries who came to this continent in the beginning, and in a particular way, the Jesuits. You guys know that the Jesuits, right, today their reputation isn't quite as strong as it used to be, but back basically from the 1500s all the way up until the mid-1900s, right, the Jesuits were kind of like the Navy SEALs of the church. They were remarkable men. Their motto was Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, right, which means for the greater glory of God. And so basically the Jesuits, right, they became priests and they dedicated their entire lives to the service of the mission of the gospel. And they were very intense about it. They basically believed that in order to evangelize the world, right, they had to learn all sorts of skills that would give them a great reputation among the people to whom they ministered. Right, so the Jesuits who were in Europe, right, they became the greatest intellectuals. Literally, so many of the greatest scientists in world history, if you read the history books, right, so many of them are Jesuit priests. They wanted to be at the very top of their field so they would earn the respect of all their colleagues. The Jesuits who were sent on missions to foreign lands, right, many, especially those who came to North America, right, they had to learn all sorts of different languages that the natives spoke. Many of the Jesuits were sent into territories that were hostile to Catholicism. Shortly after the Protestant Reformation, there were wars that broke out between Catholic and Protestant nations. And so often the Jesuits were targets of persecution and martyrdom. And they had to become very skilled in the field of apologetics, extremely learned in the scriptures and the different arguments that Protestants would make, right? They were like the Navy SEALs of the church. And some of the most inspiring ones among them were the ones who came to North America. Right, there's some great movies out there about this. You can watch the movie The Black Robe or The Mission, right? It kind of gives you an idea of what the Jesuits did. But the Jesuits didn't just come to North America and evangelize. That was certainly the most important thing they did. But they also built up the culture. Right, The Mission is an amazing movie that kind of portrays this, about how the Jesuits would go into these jungle villages, and 20 years later, right, there would be cathedrals built, right, in those places. And all of the people were taught in music and other things, right? And they had these beautiful choirs. But today we celebrate the feast of a few North American martyrs in particular. St. John de Brebeuf and St. Isaac Jogues. Brebeuf High School over by Zionsville, right, is named after St. John de Brebeuf, right, and his companions. And a lot of you are probably familiar with what happened to these men when they were martyred, right? Some of the worst and horrifying martyrdoms in the history of the church. And so it's very inspiring to see the kind of torment they were willing to endure, right, out of love for the people that they served. When the Iroquois came in, right, to basically take hold of the villages, the Hurons knew that they were coming, and they actually begged St. John de Brebeuf and his companions to leave, but they refused to abandon the Huron Indians, right? And so because of that, they suffered terrible tortures. Now, the Jesuits, one of the things that they did is they were very good at documenting everything that happened. So we have basically every detail of what took place. Now, I won't go into the details this morning because you've probably heard them before, but something that has always struck me, right, is that after St. John de Brebeuf died, the Indians actually ate his heart because they believed that if they ate the heart of a courageous man, right, they would also receive his courage. Something that I've always found that is very interesting about his death is that even though he showed no signs of pain during his martyrdom, before he came to North America, he was actually a very weak and feeble man. Right? We might think of St. John de Brebeuf as like this really tough man. But actually, when he was in formation with the Jesuits, he was actually very sick most of the time. Sometimes he was assigned to teach classes, and he couldn't even teach class because of his poor health. Right? But through the grace of God, right, he was given this supernatural courage to minister among the Indians. And so it should be a reminder to all of us that when we truly give ourselves to God, right, and we ask for his power and his grace, there's amazing things that he can do. But one of the things I wanted to mention this morning is that, again, when we read about these North American martyrs, sometimes it's tempted to just reduce them to their acts of martyrdom. But many of these missionaries, right, they spent long years and decades amongst the Indians before they suffered their martyrdom. Remember, I read a book just a few years ago about, it basically had a bunch of diary entries of these Jesuit priests. And it's amazing how inspiring and how dedicated they were to their work. They were often seen as suspicious among the Indians, right, because they dressed as priests, so they wore their black cassocks, right? So there was kind of a mystery to the priests. And because the Indians were naturally very superstitious, right, whenever there were droughts or plagues or anything like that that came through the villages, oftentimes it was the priests who were blamed for this. Likewise, as you can imagine, the Indians were not very technologically advanced. So like the Jesuits talk about how in the teepees, right, everything was clouded with smoke because there was no ventilation and they could hardly see. They talked about how when they would sleep on the ground, they would often get covered with fleas. Right? Imagine the daily suffering that these men endured for the furthering of the gospel. I think it should be an inspiration to all of us, right? What are we willing to endure to spread the gospel? And I think it would be easy for us to say, well, we're not called to be missionaries. We're not called to go to other lands or other countries. But we are called to be missionaries here in our own community. Every single one of us should have a group of people that we can count on our hands, right? Of people who we are very intentionally praying for and specifically and strategically trying to evangelize, to bring to faith in God or to bring into the church. It could be somebody who's fallen away from the church, or it could be your neighbor or your coworker. But that should be one of the main things that we pray about every day in our daily prayer, of those people who we are specifically targeting, trying to bring in the faith. And it doesn't always have to be somebody who is not Catholic either. Right? Many of our own parishioners, as you know, especially during COVID, right? A lot of our parishioners left. And it isn't just because of COVID. This happens regularly, right? So we as parishioners, we need to be looking out for each other as well, praying for people and seeking them out, right? Reaching out to them strategically. The Jesuits, when every day, even though they had all these sufferings, right, they were very intentional about how they were evangelizing the people around them. And I think too often as Catholics, we don't make evangelization a priority. And so literally weeks and months and years are wasted because we are not intentionally praying for and seeking people out to bring into the faith. Imagine if you did this intentionally for a year, with 5 people in your close quarters. Right? Imagine the kinds of conversations you could bring up to them, the kind of opportunities you could look out for, right, and seek to bring up the faith in conversation. People can't help but be influenced by us if we are intentionally living that way and trying to bring them in. So I think it's important on this feast of these North American martyrs to not simply be in awe of their martyrdom at the end of their lives, but rather to be inspired by their intentional and zealous pursuit of evangelization. And we should ask for their help and be inspired by their example.